want to start with a number. 1820. They say that year was the first time Antarctica was mentioned. For the majority of my life, I accepted that they would say, first officially cited, first recorded, first documented, first acknowledged. I didn't question it. Why would I? It's in the textbooks. It's in the timelines. It's the kind of knowledge you pick up in school in the same manner that you blindly absorb everything else. But after that, the dates piqued my interest. With caution, once I got going, I couldn't stop. Before we proceed, I have to briefly go over a subject I covered in the prior video in this series. The rest of what follows won't be as strong without that foundation. So if you haven't seen it, I'll provide you a link below. In that episode, I examined 1816, which is known in popular history as a year without a summer. The year following the eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia, which, according to official statistics, threw enough ash into the sky to lower global. Temperatures can actually turn summer into winter, kill animals, destroy harvests across the northern hemisphere, and inflict starvation from New England to northern Europe. Tambora is only one volcano. It's a good explanation. The timeline is neat. But I started pulling at threads unrelated to that story, because the official narrative fails to explain the homogeneity. The entire continent was swept at the same moment as the collapse. Failures of crops were not localized. They were all over the planet. Unusual cold reports of June sunsets are purple and orange with snow. They were not clustered in close proximity to Indonesia. They appeared everywhere at once. And not just in terms of the environment, politics, and society. In the years immediately after 1816, a number of institutional upheavals, population changes, and what one researcher I met referred to as civilizational amnesia took place. Whole communities that don't appear to have any historical significance. I am aware that a lot of you felt uneasy about what I recommended in that video. And good. It should. I propose that a year without a summer was not a volcanic event. Hence, it might not have been entirely a volcanic event. That the 1816 atmospheric disturbance was more similar to what is today called a nuclear winter, more catastrophic and more deliberate. A sudden, total blackout of the atmosphere brought on by a reset that puts an end to civilization rather than a mountain. The kind of occurrence that would leave behind both climate data and erasure. The kind of event that is currently partly connected to, with the theory that prior to the 19th century, there existed a sophisticated, cross-continental old-world civilization that we have come to refer to as Tartaria. It's harder to define than a nation with borders on a modern map or an empire in conventional sense. A presence, a culture whose fingerprints may be found everywhere if you know how to recognize them. The architecture, canal networks, and seemingly completed city grids. It seems to have simply disappeared from the historical record without any scaffolding period, construction documents, or the disorganized, slow archaeology that should come before human occupation. We talk about all of it, but one thing kept coming up. One date looked almost too convenient and well-positioned, so I kept putting it off. Antarctica's discovery date. 1820 was 4 years after the year without a summer. I want you to consider that gap. Not 4 years, not a generation, nor a century has gone by 4 years after what would have been the most disastrous weather event in human history. If my previous assessment is accurate, this could have been the final act of a global civilizational collapse. A simultaneous worldwide freezing event. Suddenly, the most remote, inaccessible, sealed, and frozen landmass in the world is officially discovered. And not just one expedition, but 3 at once. There was a British team, an American crew, and a Russian staff at work. We are told that they all happened separately in 1820 in the same region and within months of one another. I won't stand here and tell you that's not feasible, though. People look for new information. Expeditions overlap with one another. Competition is what drives exploration. I think all that makes sense. But I want to ask a different kind of question. Not if it happened, but why? Why did the Phoenicians, Greeks, Romans, Chinese, and every other advanced maritime society that has ever existed follow millennia of human civilization? Dig a hole to allow water to enter? Why is the largest land mass south of the equator still entirely unidentified, unrecorded, and unnamed for years after the world's sky turned dark? Why then? because this is where the conventional story starts to fall apart. As I looked farther into the historical record, that is, into archives that aren't covered in first-year history classes, the 1820 discovery date began to feel less like a beginning and more like a cover tale. There are actual maps, historical maps that have survived from before 1820 show Antarctica. A southern landmass with a precise shoreline is shown on the Piri Reis map, which was constructed in 1513 by an Ottoman admiral who made it obvious that he was building it from previous source maps. It is not a fuzzy blob or a fictitious fringe. Rather, it is a mapped shoreline that, when compared to modern satellite imagery of the subglacial topography in the 20th century, the real rock beneath 2 miles of ice align with an accuracy that no one has. Explained. The Artius FAUS map from 1531 goes one step farther. It depicts an ice-free Antarctica with mountain ranges, river systems, and internal topographical characteristics that were only confirmed by sonar technology in the mid-1900s. I'll repeat it more carefully because I believe it's easy to read past that. Geographical aspects of Antarctica depicted on a map, created in 1531, were not technologically verified until the 1950s. The official explanation collapses almost immediately due to the weight of that line. The scholarly response has usually been one of coincidence, lucky extrapolation, or the notion that ancient cartographers were only conjecturing about a southern landmass for geometrical and philosophical reasons. Symmetry, equilibrium, and the idea that the north and south must be equal. That might be the case. Maybe that's simply a coincidence. But how can a river be guessed? How can the estimation of subglacial mountain ridges be done? 5 centuries later, how can a shoreline be reliably calculated so that it can be compared to satellite data? You don't guess that. You don't theorize that. Presence, observation, and firsthand or inherited knowledge from those in attendance are all used to map it. And that raises a problem that the mainstream record has never adequately addressed. Who was there? You might want to consider joining or subscribing to YouTube if you believe this is worth your time, which I genuinely hope you are. Since this series explores topics that most channels won't, having you along for the voyage is essential. Let's go back to Antarctica. We're just getting started. I'd like to take a quick look back at 1816, because I think we've been looking at it incorrectly. Regardless of the true cause, I contended in the last movie that the climatic disaster of 1816 could have been the demise of an ancient planetary civilization, the point at which something ended. The ensuing nuclear winter may have been a tragedy of civilizational proportions, leaving behind depopulated cities, abandoned infrastructure, and a historical record so thin that it hardly qualifies as a record at all. But what if that framing is just partially true? What if 1816 wasn't really the end? What if it was also a start for another person? This is the theory I have been sitting with. But I want to be clear that this is a question rather than a conclusion. What if, in addition to changing the climate of the Northern Hemisphere, the atmospheric event of 1816, whatever caused it, had the ability to accelerate glaciation at the poles? What if there was a compounding impact from the same process that turned summer into winter in Europe and North America, drove the formation of ice southward? What if 1816 was a deliberate trial run for Antarctica, the ice-free continent depicted on 16th century maps, or the final phase of the freezing process? I understand that this is a significant assertion, and I will not make it. I'm making it into a shape, a pattern of timing, place, and repression that I can't stop thinking about, because I'm afraid of what might occur next. In 1816, the sky grows gloomy. A global atmospheric phenomena of civilization is upended by unprecedented scope. Antarctica was discovered, officially documented, given a name, cataloged, and claimed in 1820, not before, during, or 4 years after. You can't take your eyes off the pattern once you see it. Stay with the timeline. It doesn't finish in 1820. The charts, the data, and the painstakingly maintained secret of Antarctica's actual nature are all recurring themes. Decades later, in the hands of people who have all the means to travel, and in 1946, a year after the end of World War II, the U.S. Navy launches Operation High Jump, a full-scale military mission to Antarctica that is neither a small exploration ship nor a research team. Rear Admiral Richard Byrd, one of the most illustrious naval captains in American history, oversaw 33 aircraft, 13 ships, and nearly 5,000 soldiers. The declared objectives were to establish a base and conduct a scientific mapping research. But maybe that was all. But this is a part when the timing cannot be disregarded. Given that the United States was not the first military power to give Antarctica serious consideration. Not even close. 7 years before the high jump, in 1938, Nazi Germany launched its own Antarctic expedition, the Schwaben Land Expedition. After surveying almost 600,000 square kilometers of territory and laying thousands of marker stakes to demonstrate territorial claim, they apparently returned with something that altered internal priorities at the highest levels. What exactly? They keep it a secret from us. The records are deficient in the specific way that records usually are when they respond to questions. We do know that some senior members of the Nazi scientific apparatus were known to be fixated on lost civilizations and prehistoric cultural traditions that were believed to have existed before the modern world, and that German submarines were known to be operating in Antarctic waters as late as 1945. Since the same map's the same thread, we go back to the custodian issue. From the Pyrie race map and the Orontius FAUS map, the admiral claims that he used older resources to produce the charts. Items are never recognized, never located, and never taken into account. Someone owned that knowledge. Because of the chain of hands that maintained it intact for generations, it was sufficiently intact for several parties during the 1816 rupture. It appeared to be followed to the same spot by a Nazi expedition, an Ottoman admiral, and an American naval force. Who were they? What did the three find when they got there? That is not addressed by the evidence, but it is also not refuted. I now want to talk about what we are not allowed to do, because this is part of the conversation about Antarctica that most people overlook is, in my opinion, the most important component. Antarctica is not allowed. Of course you can. Expeditions go there all the time. And yes, they do. Scientific expeditions, government-sanctioned research missions, tourism, even in limited and highly supervised forms. I'm not saying the continent is surrounded by an invisible wall. What I'm saying is this: the Antarctic Treaty System, signed in 1959 and now ratified by over 50. It is nearly impossible to conduct independent, unsupervised exploration of the Antarctic interior due to Antarctica's designation as a scientific reserve and the explicit prohibition of military operations, mineral extraction, and nuclear testing on the continent. This is because you need logistical support, which only governments and large institutions can provide, and you need permissions, which are quietly difficult to obtain for anything outside of approved research parameters. As a result, Antarctica is practically the only place on Earth where the average 21st century citizen simply cannot go and look around. I want to know why that feels normal to us. Every other land mass on the planet, every mountain range, every jungle, and every desert can be accessed by a motivated individual with enough resources and determination. People climb Everest recreationally. People cross the Sahara alone, sail to the world's most remote islands with nothing more than a small boat and a compass. But Antarctica has a treaty that 50 nations signed in the same decade that sonar technology first revealed what was hidden beneath the ice. We don't think that's particularly noteworthy, and we nod along, accepting that the treaty is about science, peace, and environmental preservation. Maybe it is, but the evidence suggests that simultaneous global agreement is extremely rare, as nations disagree on nearly everything. With the exception of this one place, the 20th century was essentially defined by national disagreement about borders, resources, ideology, language, and everything else. The longer you sit with it, the harder it is to ignore the coordination issue. 50 nations, all agreeing, all signing, all maintaining consistently for decades about a frozen continent that officially contains nothing but ice and penguins. What is it about ice and penguins that requires an international treaty? Let me explain about the architecture issue, since this is where the Tartaria connection stops being abstract. Over the course of the series, we have provisionally and imperfectly documented the existence of outdated building techniques in places where they have no right to be. Buildings that appear in a historical record fully completed without construction phases, and civic infrastructure in cities that were supposedly founded in the early 19th century, but would have required decades and resources that those fledgling settlements simply did not have. This pattern is repeated throughout North America, Europe, Russia, and South America. It is not regional, isolated, or global. Examples include cathedrals in frontier towns, complex sewer systems in cities that, according to official records, were wilderness 5 years prior to the system's installation, evidence of mud floods, buried ground floors, and windows that begin below what is now street level because the street level has risen or because something fell and covered what was already there. In the case of Antarctica, we know from the geographic evidence, the ice-free maps, and the official explanation that either dismissal or a kind of casual hand-waving dissolves upon contact with the actual evidence. The timelines don't work, the documentation is thin, the transition periods are missing, the workforce that was supposed to build these structures is unaccounted for, and the supply chains are non-existent. I'm not saying that there are pyramids under the Antarctic ice sheet, but there are structures in the Ellsworth Mountains that have generated serious, scholarly debate about their geometry. Subglacial topography indicates that Antarctica was once a habitable landmass. It's not geologically ancient, but it's recent enough that humans mapped it. Those maps survived into the 16th century, copied from even older sources. What was on that continent? What is currently beneath 2 meters of ice? Claiming that there's a lost city hidden beneath the Ross Ice Shelf. I'm posing a more straightforward, but in my opinion, more important question. Why don't we know? In 2025, with satellite systems capable of reading license plates from orbit and ground-penetrating radar technology, capable of imaging geological features thousands of meters below the surface, with the full weight of the most technologically advanced civilization in recorded history pointed at every corner of the Earth, why is Antarctica's subglacial topography still largely unmapped at? High resolution? Why do the gaps in the data cluster in the interior? Why does the silence persist? When you start looking for it, it's all over this story. There isn't a serious institutional investigation into the coordination issue of 1820. 3 separate expeditions arriving at the same time in an undiscovered continent. And there isn't a serious mainstream academic discussion of the peer race map in introductory curriculum. If it does appear at all, it's a footnote. No convergence, coincidence. There is no explanation for how the frozen wasteland we officially discovered in the 19th century differs from the ice-free maps of the 16th century. If the ice accumulated over geological time, as we are told, human cartographers create maps depicting the unique terrain in historical time. The silence on the scale across this many disciplines, maintained for this long, isn't accidental. That's a shape, and that shape suggests something. I won't tell you what it suggests. I want to wrap up with a thought that has been on my mind ever since I began this thread. If we accept, tentatively, cautiously, and with all due skepticism, that a highly developed global civilization existed before the 19th century, if we accept that the civilization left behind knowledge, maps, infrastructure, and architectural techniques that our official history cannot account for, and if we accept that the events of 1816 represented in some way the terminal convulsion of that, if we acknowledge that Antarctica, the final uncharted and ice-free landmass on those earlier maps, was sealed, frozen, treaty-locked, and discreetly removed from public access in the years that followed, we must ask the most difficult question. What were they protecting? Maybe not from us. Maybe from time, maybe from chaos, or maybe just from the kind of reckless, disorganized, uncontrolled discovery. To be honest, I don't know the answer. I've been sitting with these questions for months, and they haven't been answered. Instead, they have only gotten deeper. If anyone with a ship and a curiosity could sail down and start digging, that might have happened. What knowledge was stored there? What records? What architecture? What evidence of civilization that we have been prevented from knowing by some combination of catastrophe, intentional erasure, and institutional incuriosity? An unprecedentedly large-scale and long-lasting atmospheric disaster in 1816. An official continent found 4 years later by 3 nations at once. Sealed by 50 nations a century later. Old maps showing what's beneath the ice. A historical record that silences at certain times. Where continuity should exist, architecture without builders, cities without origins, a civilization without a gravestone, and a continent renamed, restricted, ice-covered, and quietly held just out of reach that may contain less than 2 miles of frozen silence. The answer to all of that, maybe or maybe not, but I can't stop thinking about the number 1,820, and I doubt you will either. If you think this series is worthwhile, Please leave a comment below with your thoughts or theories. The next video goes somewhere I wasn't sure I was ready.